Mother-in-law looked me dead in the eyes across that kitchen table and said I was the worst thing that ever happened to her son. She said I had ruined his life, dragged him down, and that the baby I was carrying was just proof of how manipulative I really was. She told me to get out of her house and take my problems with me. My husband stood right beside her and said nothing. That was 7 years ago. Last month, my assistant called me from the lobby of the Fairmont in downtown Chicago to let me know there was a woman asking for me at the front desk. She said she was my mother-in-law. She looked, my assistant said, like she had been crying for a while. I told him to let her wait, and I took my time finishing my coffee. My name is Simone Weller. I was 26 years old when everything I thought I had built my life on turned out to be made of wet paper. And I need to tell you how I rebuilt it out of something that actually holds. Growing up in Naperville, Illinois, I was the kind of girl who organized her homework by color and had a 5-year plan before she turned 17. My parents were practical people. My father drove a delivery route for a food distributor. My mother did bookkeeping part-time and kept the house running like a well-oiled machine. We weren't wealthy, but we were stable, and stability was something I came to treat almost like a religion. I believed in doing things right. I believed in earning what you had. I believed, probably more than was good for me, that if you followed the right steps, life would follow back. I met my husband at a university mixer in my junior year. He was a finance major named Brandon Holt, tall, certain of himself in a way that felt like confidence then, and reads very differently to me now. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in a crowded room, which is a gift, until you realize he's doing it to everyone. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Saturday in October outside the restaurant where we'd had our first real dinner. I said yes before he even finished asking. His family was from Barrington, which, if you know the Chicago suburbs, tells you something about the kind of world they moved through. His mother, Loretta Holt, was the kind of woman who wore pearls to casual lunches and spoke in a voice that never quite rose above polished. She had spent 30 years shaping her family's image the way other women tend a garden, cutting back anything that didn't fit the design. She was polite to me at holidays, warm enough, but I always felt, in the way you feel something before you can name it, that I was being tolerated rather than welcomed. Brandon's father was quieter, more absent in the soft way of men who learned early that the house ran better when they stayed out of it. He nodded at me when I spoke. He never said anything unkind. He also never said anything that mattered. Brandon and I moved into an apartment in Wicker Park after the wedding. We were 24. I had a job at a mid-sized marketing firm doing content strategy. He was working at a financial advising firm, putting in the long hours that always come with those first years of trying to prove yourself. We were busy and tired and a little stretched thin, but I told myself that was just what early marriage looked like. I told myself we were building something. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in February. I sat on the bathroom floor for a while after the test. Not from devastation, but from the weight of it, the realness of it. That particular feeling of a door opening that you didn't know was in the wall. I was nervous, but underneath the nervousness was something that surprised me. I wanted her. I wanted this. Brandon came home and I told him at dinner. His reaction was careful, measured. He said things like, "We'll figure it out," and "This is a lot to process." I told myself that was fine. He was a planner. He needed time to adjust. I gave him time. He spent the next 3 weeks sleeping later than usual and coming home quieter than before. I kept telling myself he was adjusting. I kept choosing the generous interpretation. Then he told me he thought we'd made a mistake. Not the pregnancy. The marriage. He sat me down on a Sunday morning, the apartment gray with winter light, and told me he wasn't sure he'd been ready. He said he felt trapped. He said he cared about me, but wasn't sure he'd ever been in love with me the way he was supposed to be. He said it like he was reading from a script he'd been rehearsing, which I later understood he probably had been. Not for weeks. For much longer. I asked him what this meant. He said he thought we should separate. I was 2 months pregnant and my husband wanted out. I held myself together through that conversation because there was nothing else to do. When he left to go visit a friend that afternoon, I went into the bathroom and sat on the floor again. the same floor where I'd taken the test 3 weeks earlier, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. The floor was cold. The tile had a small crack in one corner that I'd been meaning to ask the landlord about for months. You notice things like that when you're falling apart. The ordinary details of a life that's still standing around you, while something essential in it collapses. That evening, Brandon told me his mother wanted to have us both over. To talk, he said, to help figure out the next steps. I should have known then. Loretta's house in Barrington had this kitchen that looked like something out of a magazine, the kind of kitchen that gets used for entertaining more than cooking. She had set out coffee and a plate of cookies that looked beautiful and untouched. We sat down. Brandon sat next to his mother. I noticed that immediately. She didn't lead with anything soft. She looked at me across that table with the particular composure of a woman who has decided what she believes and cleared away everything else, and she told me that I had taken advantage of her son. She said I had pushed this marriage before he was ready. She said the pregnancy, and she said that word like it had quotation marks around it, was either an accident that proved my carelessness or a calculation that proved something worse. She said her son had been trying to do the right thing, but that the right thing was not to trap himself in a life he hadn't chosen. She told me I needed to figure out my own situation and let Brandon find his way back to where he was supposed to be. I looked at Brandon. He was looking at the cookie plate. I waited for him to say something, to push back, to say my name, to do anything. He reached over and adjusted the coffee cup in front of him so that the handle pointed the other direction. His father was in the living room. I could hear the television, a hockey game. I told Loretta that her son had proposed to me, that he had chosen this, that I had not manufactured a pregnancy to entrap a man who had been in my life for 4 years and in my apartment for 2 of them. My voice stayed even. I was proud of that later. She told me that young men sometimes feel pressured into things, and that a woman with any decency would recognize that and step back. I understood in that moment that there was no version of this conversation that would end any differently. She had decided what had happened. Brandon had decided to let her decide, and I was sitting in a kitchen in Barrington with a baby growing in me and nowhere inside that room to land. I drove home alone. Brandon stayed at his mother's. Over the next several weeks, things moved in the way these things move, when the people involved are more concerned with protecting themselves than with doing right. Brandon's family hired an attorney before I had even processed what was happening. The message through the attorney was that Brandon was willing to support the baby financially, but wanted to establish from the beginning that the marriage had been a mistake and that the separation was mutual. Mutual, as if I'd sat on the floor of that bathroom in February and thought, what a great moment to blow up my own life. I called my parents. My mother cried. My father went quiet in the way he does when he's trying to stay calm so he can actually be useful. Then he said, come home for a while. Get your bearings. I didn't. I couldn't quite face it yet, the going home, the reversal of everything. Instead, I stayed in Wicker Park in an apartment that was now too expensive for one salary and tried to figure out what I was doing. I kept going to work. I don't have a better explanation for that than it was the only thing I knew how to do. I made content strategy decks. I answered emails. I sat in meetings and contributed, and then went home and ate crackers because nothing else sounded good, and read about what week the baby was in and what size she was supposed to be. A lemon, then a peach, then a navel orange. I tracked her progress in fruit while my life reorganized itself around me. My coworker, a woman named Adrienne, noticed what I wasn't saying. She brought me soup one Thursday without explaining why, just set it on my desk and went back to her own work. Small things like that stay with you. They stay with you longer than the big dramatic gestures. Before I go further, if this story is reaching you somewhere, please take a second to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see everyone, and they mean more than you know. Okay, back to where we were. Brandon's attorney sent paperwork. Separation agreement, a proposed parenting plan before the baby was even born, financial disclosures. I hired my own attorney with money I had to pull from savings, and I learned things about legal proceedings that I had never wanted to know. I learned that the word mutual in a legal document is a fiction that serves whoever writes the document. I learned that the system is not particularly interested in who was wronged. It is interested in outcomes and timelines and signatures. My daughter was born in September. I named her May, after my grandmother, because my grandmother had been the toughest woman I'd ever known, and I wanted my daughter to have something of that before she even knew what tough meant. She arrived in the world loud and certain of herself, which made me laugh and cry at the same time. The nurse asked if I wanted to call anyone to come in. I said her grandparents were on their way. That was true. My parents drove up from Naperville and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, but on Brandon's side, there was nothing. Loretta did not come. Brandon arrived an hour after May was born, stayed for 40 minutes, held her briefly, and left. He took a photograph before he went. I've thought about that photograph often. What he does with it. Whether it sits somewhere in his life as evidence of something he chose to step away from. I went home to Wicker Park with a baby in a diaper bag and the specific terror of a person who has to figure out everything alone. My mother stayed for 10 days. She showed me things and then let me do them myself, which was exactly the right way to help someone. My father came on weekends and fixed everything in the apartment that had been broken for months. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. When my mother left, the quiet settled in. May slept in a second-hand bassinet I'd found on Facebook Marketplace. The rent was due and the legal fees were accumulating, and I was on maternity leave from a job that wasn't going to hold the position forever. I ran numbers on my phone at 2 a.m. while she nursed. I made spreadsheets about money I didn't have. I cried quietly so I wouldn't wake her, and then felt guilty about crying when she was right there, this tiny person who only knew I was warm and present in hers. The divorce was finalized when May was 4 months old. Brandon paid child support according to the agreement, which was not nothing, but wasn't enough to cover everything in a city like Chicago. He took May every other weekend according to the parenting plan. He was consistent, I'll give him that. Consistent in the way of someone following a schedule rather than someone who can't stand to be away. Loretta never called, not to ask about May, not to acknowledge her existence, not once in those first months, when a grandmother might have reached across whatever had happened between adults and simply said, "I'd like to know this child." She didn't. And I stopped leaving that door open. I went back to work when May was 12 weeks old. I arranged daycare at a center near my office, which took a significant portion of my salary, which is the particular financial trap that working mothers in this country know very well. I was exhausted in a way I hadn't understood was possible before. The kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and hums quietly in everything you do. But I went. And I worked. And I came home and picked up May and we figured out each night together. A year after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in a mandatory professional development seminar at work, half listening, when the presenter said something I've never forgotten. She said the skills that save you in a crisis are usually the ones you've been practicing so long you've stopped noticing them. I had been doing content strategy for 4 years. I understood what made people stop and read. What made them stay? What made them stay? What made them trust a brand enough to engage with it? I had been doing that work without thinking of it as anything more than a job. I started doing freelance content work on the side. Small clients at first. A local bakery. A dentist's office that needed a newsletter. A boutique gym in Lincoln Park that wanted to build an email list. I did this work after May went to sleep, my laptop open on the kitchen table, still in my work clothes because I hadn't had a chance to change. I charged rates that I later realized were too low, but it got me started, and getting started turned out to be the only part that required nerve. The rest required repetition. Within 8 months, I had enough freelance income to quit my full-time job. I want to say that sentence plainly, because it still surprises me when I do. I walked into my manager's office on a Tuesday afternoon and gave my notice, and she looked at me like I had announced something dangerous. Maybe I had. It felt that way. I launched a boutique content agency I called Clearline Creative. The name came from a conversation with May, who was 2 by then, and had recently learned the word clear and was applying it to everything. Clear juice. Clear sky. Clear road. I liked the idea of clarity as something you could build toward. I took 3 of my freelance clients with me and cold emailed 30 more. 12 responded. 6 became clients. 2 of those 6 are still with me today. What I had was not glamour. I had a laptop, a home office that was also the second bedroom that I was going to have to move May out of eventually, a spreadsheet, and a very specific understanding of what it feels like to have no cushion. That last part, weirdly, was an advantage. I didn't take on debt. I couldn't see a path to paying back. I didn't say yes to work that wasn't right just to look bigger than I was. I kept things clean. I kept things clear. May was 3 when she asked me why we didn't have a yard. She had been at a birthday party at a house in Wicker Park and came home talking about the grass and the swing set. And could we get grass? I got down to her level and told her that someday we would have a yard bigger than that one. She went and got a piece of paper and drew it immediately, a house, enormous in the way children draw the things they want, with a yard that covered most of the page. She drew 2 people holding hands. She said that was us. I folded that drawing and put it in my wallet, and I have carried it to every meeting, every pitch, every closing since. The agency grew because I made it grow. I am not someone who believes in luck as a business strategy. I believe in showing up earlier than you have to, learning more than you're asked to, and solving problems before the client knows they have them. I hired my first employee when May was 4. Her name is Josephine, and she is still with me and is better at half of what we do than I am, which is exactly the kind of person you should hire. I hired 2 more people the following year. By the time May started kindergarten, Clearline Creative had 9 clients retaining us monthly and a waitlist. I did not think about Brandon often. I thought about him the way you think about weather that has passed, occasionally when something reminds you of it, without particular feeling in either direction. He had remarried by then, a woman named Heather who seemed, from the few times our paths crossed at handoffs, perfectly fine. Normal. Whatever Brandon was offering her, I hoped it was more than he'd been able to offer me. Not out of bitterness. Out of a genuine understanding that some people grow into what they should have been all along. Just not with the person they started with. Loretta. I thought about less, which, if you've never been discarded by someone who was supposed to be family, might sound easy. It wasn't, at first. In those early months, I used to replay that kitchen conversation in Barrington and imagine what I should have said. I had a whole catalogue of things I should have said. Then one day I realized the catalogue had gotten smaller without me noticing. Then I realized I had stopped adding to it. That's not healing you can force. It's the kind that just happens when you're too busy building something real to keep visiting the wreckage. I bought a house in Elmhurst when May was 6. 4 bedrooms, which was more than we needed. But I liked the idea of space. I liked the idea of never having to calculate whether we could afford to have someone over. It had a yard. Not enormous, but real grass. An actual yard with a garden bed along one side that was completely overgrown and a maple tree big enough to hang a swing from. I had a swing installed before we moved in. May was the first one on it. I had been living in Elmhurst for about a year when the agency landed a contract with a regional healthcare network that changed everything. Not because the work was glamorous, healthcare content rarely is, but because the scale was different. Suddenly, I needed to hire 4 people in the span of 6 weeks. Suddenly, I needed systems and processes that I had been holding together informally. I spent 3 months in a kind of controlled chaos, rebuilding infrastructure while doing the work simultaneously. It was the hardest stretch since those early years with May. But on the other side of it was something that looked a lot like a real company. I moved Clearline Creative into an actual office in downtown Chicago. Glass walls, a conference room that smelled like new carpet, a kitchen with a real espresso machine. I showed May the space on a Saturday before we officially moved in. She ran her hand along the conference room table, very serious, and told me it was good. High praise from an 8-year-old who had seen me work from a kitchen table for most of her life. I was 33 years old and I had something. Not family money. Not a husband's income or a safety net of any kind. Something I had built myself from 2 freelance clients and a keyword spreadsheet, and the particular motivation that comes from having nothing but a person depending on you. There is someone I should tell you about. His name is Daniel Park. He was a client before he was anything else, which is a dynamic I was careful about for a long time. He ran a sustainable architecture firm and needed help with thought leadership content. He was patient in his communications, specific in his feedback, and entirely lacking in the quality I had come to find most exhausting in people, the need to perform certainty they didn't have. Daniel knew what he didn't know. He said so plainly. I found that extraordinary. We became friends before we became anything else. He met May when she was 7. At a company picnic I had somehow agreed to let a client attend, and he talked to her like she was a full person with opinions worth hearing, which she is, and she decided immediately that he was acceptable. Coming from May, that's not a small thing. We have been together for 2 years now. He is good to her. He is honest with me even when it's inconvenient. That is all I will say about that. I had not thought about Loretta Holt in a long time when my assistant called. It was a Thursday. I was in the Chicago Fairmont for a non-profit gala where Clearline was being recognized for our pro bono work with a local women's shelter. I was wearing a dress I had bought specifically for the occasion and drinking sparkling water because I had a toast to give later and I wanted to be clear-headed. My assistant, Marcus, called my cell and said there was a woman in the lobby asking for me. She gave her name as Loretta Holt. She had apparently told the front desk she was my mother-in-law. "Farmer," I said. "Tell her I'll be down shortly." I finished my sparkling water. I reviewed my notes for the toast. I went to the restroom and checked my lipstick. I took the elevator down. She was sitting in a chair near the lobby entrance, and she looked, in the plainest terms I can offer, diminished. The particular kind of diminishment that comes not from age alone, but from strain. She was thinner than I remembered. The composure that had always been her most reliable accessory was frayed at the edges. She was holding her purse in her lap with both hands in a way that looked less like poise and more like an anchor. She stood when she saw me. She said my name. Simone. I said hello. She said she was sorry to come like this without calling. She said she hadn't known how to call. She said she had been trying to find the right time for a long time. I told her I was in the middle of an event and had about 15 minutes. She started to talk. The shape of what she said was familiar. The way apology speeches often have a recognizable shape. Acknowledgement of time past, admission that things had been said, assertion that she hadn't been herself, suggestion that family should find a way to come together. She talked about Brandon, who had divorced Heather and was struggling. She talked about her own health, something with her heart that required monitoring. She talked about how she had thought about May, about how she'd like to know her granddaughter. I let her finish, then I said, "You came to that kitchen in Barrington and told me I had taken advantage of your son. You implied I had manufactured a pregnancy to trap him. You watched him sit there and say nothing, and you didn't tell him to be a man and own his choices. You made me feel like a problem to be managed instead of a person, and then you disappeared. You never called to check on your grandchild, not once. May is 7 years old and you have never sent her a birthday card." Loretta's chin moved. She said she knew. She said she had been wrong. I said, "I believe you believe that." She asked if she could have another chance. She said she just wanted to know May. She said it wasn't too late. I thought about May, who at that moment was with my parents in Naperville, probably watching a movie and eating too much popcorn, and being completely certain that she was loved by everyone in her orbit. May, who knew I was her mother and Daniel was someone who loved us both, and my parents were her grandparents and her world was stable and warm and hers. May, who had never once been made to feel like a complication. I told Loretta that May had a full life with people who had been there for all of it, that introducing someone new, someone she didn't know, wasn't a decision I could make lightly or quickly, that the door was not something I could promise to open just because she had finally decided to knock. She asked what she could do. I told her honestly, I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe that's just how it is when you wait too long. She looked at me for a moment. I saw something in her face that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding, or might have been grief, or both. I have learned not to read too much into people's expressions in these moments. I have learned that what someone feels in a lobby is not the same as what they're capable of doing over time. I told her I had to go back upstairs. I told her to take care of herself. She thanked me. She actually thanked me for those 15 minutes. I took the elevator back up. I gave the toast. I smiled at the right moments and I meant most of them. And when I came home that night and found May already asleep, I sat on the edge of her bed and watched her breathe for a while, the way you do when they're small, this unconscious inventory of her. checking that she was still whole. She was. She is. I have not made any decisions about Loretta. That is the true version of what happened. I didn't close a gate in her face with finality. I didn't open my arms. I stood in the middle of a hotel lobby and I told the truth, and then I went back to my evening. The door is not open. It isn't nailed shut. What it is mine to decide in my own time on my terms. That is what nobody expected. Not the estate, not the agency, not the moment of confrontation at a charity gala where I had a toast to give and a full life to return to. What nobody expected was that I would come through all of it without rage, without the need for revenge that people talk about like it's a destination. I don't live there. There's no version of my life where rage would have fit next to May and Daniel and the maple tree in my yard and a company I built with my own hands. I started with nothing and a person depending on me. That turns out to be enough. I rose not because anyone believed in me. I rose because May needed a mother who knew how. And once I knew how, I couldn't stop. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one. There's something nobody tells you about being discarded by the people who were supposed to claim you. They tell you about the anger. They tell you about the grief, but they don't tell you about the strange clarity that comes after. When the noise of other people's opinions finally stops and you're left with just yourself and the question of what you're actually made of. I didn't plan to become someone who runs a company. I planned to be a good wife in a Wicker Park apartment and build something quietly with a man who turned out not to want any of it. What I got instead was a bankruptcy of the life I thought I was living, handed to me in a kitchen in Barrington by a woman who had already decided what I was worth. And here's what I know now that I didn't know then. The people who write you off are not neutral. They are not simply wrong about you. They are doing you the specific favor of showing you exactly where you would have stayed small, if they had let you stay. Loretta Holt needed me to be a problem. She needed the story of her son's marriage to be my fault, my manipulation, my failure, because the alternative required her to look at her son clearly, and she was not willing to do that. When she sat across that table from me and said what she said, she was not reading my character. She was protecting her own version of events. I was 26 years old, and I sat there and absorbed it. And for a long time, I carried it the way you carry something you don't know yet, that you're allowed to put down. What changed was May. Not in the sentimental way, not the way people romanticize struggle when a baby makes everything worthwhile. It was more practical than that. May needed someone who knew how to handle a difficult situation and stay standing. So I learned how to do that. I learned it because there was no one else in that apartment who was going to do it for me. Necessity is not beautiful. It is just relentless. And relentlessness, it turns out, is the thing. I think about what would have happened if Loretta had been kind to me. If Brandon had chosen differently, I would probably still be in marketing. I would have built a smaller life around a smaller version of what I thought was possible. Instead, I was pushed into open water, and I had to either swim or not, and I swam. And I kept swimming until I was somewhere I never would have aimed for if anyone had left me comfortable. That is not gratitude. I want to be clear about that. What was done to me was wrong. The silence was wrong. The kitchen table was wrong. The years of not calling to ask about a child who shares her son's face were wrong. I don't owe those choices my thanks, but I can hold two things at once. I can know that the cruelty was real and also know that it pushed me somewhere real. Both of those things are true. When Loretta stood in that hotel lobby and asked what she could do, I told her honestly that I didn't know. That is still true. I don't know if she's capable of being what May deserves. I don't know if I have the energy to find out. What I know is that the decision is mine, not hers, not Brandon's, mine, and that is the whole distance between who I was at that kitchen table and who I am now. May drew us a house when she was 3. 2 people, a yard, enough space. We have that now. I built it, and no one who ever doubted me gets credit for a single square foot of it.